From the foot of the dining couch, this is Here Be Monsters. A couple days ago, I biked out to a plant nursery on kind of the edge of the city to pick up a couple plants that they said they had there. I was looking for herbs, and I couldn't find them in any of the grocery stores. So I went out there and just bought them in plant form. I think the people in the store might have thought I was going to put them in my yard as ornamentals, but really I'm going to cook with them. It was two plants. One of them is called lovage, and one of them is called rue. And both of these were kind of central herbs in ancient Roman cuisine. They're both still cultivated today, but not in any large numbers, at least not here in the United States. So I bought these two plants, $6 each. And I took them out to the parking lot and just plucked a couple leaves off of each of them and tasted them. And the lovage, it looks very much like parsley, but the flavor is very strong. It's very bitter. And just one leaf is enough to fill your whole mouth with this kind of just general herbaceous, bitter, kind of celery-like flavor. And the rue, it's like, how do you describe a flavor you've never tasted before? I guess I could say it was also bitter. But one known quality of rue, and this is something that I experienced, is that it makes your tongue go numb. And that's a pretty weird feeling, you know? I've heard before that plants that we call herbs, the thing that we like about them is the thing that other species don't like about them, right? Like, imagine trying to get any nutritionally significant amount of calories off of a plant that makes your tongue go numb. It's like a pretty good discouraging trait, but what we've learned to do is we've learned to spice our foods. We've learned to put tiny amounts of flavorful compounds into our foods to make them taste the way they taste. And I think those things are deeply culturally related. And I think part of that is due to natural forces, like what plants will grow in any given area. And partly due to conflict and war and conquest. These are things that have huge effects on how we view ourselves as a people, how we view ourselves as a society. And that's why I was so interested when I found out about this Roman cookbook from 2,000 years ago. We know that the authors of these books were slave cooks. They were people who had been taken from Roman conquest, brought back into the Roman Empire to serve the Roman upper class. So we don't know any of their names, but we do have their recipes, we do have their words. It's a really fascinating and kind of rare document that allows us to see into the past in a way that is fairly unprecedented. So after the break, I'm going to talk to the author and historian Sally Grainger, who's someone who's studied this collection of recipes called Apicius and believes that it's very possible to understand history by eating ancient foods and understanding the context that they were cooked in. Before I send you to the intro, though, I just want to let you know one thing, which is that there are new Here Be Monster stickers available for purchase. You can find a link in the show notes, and there's pictures up on the website, which is hbmpodcast.com/store. Okay, more after the break.
Here Be Monsters, the podcast about
a special pair of dining slippers that you carry with you.
The podcast about the unknown.
Hello, I'm Sally Grainger. I am a Roman food historian. I work with archaeology and history and text to understand the food of the ancient world, how they processed it and how they consumed it. I have published a number of books, including The Cooking Apicius, which is a little handbook on how to cook Roman food today in the modern world. And I've also written a book about ancient fish sauce called The Story of Garum.
I was wondering if you could tell me about the day that you first found out about the book, about Apicius.
Oh, wow. I was not at all interested in academia when I was 16. I left and trained to be a chef. And I didn't know very much about Roman history at all, but I did know about I, Claudius. And this is a TV series that we had in the 70s telling the story of the Emperor Claudius. And it's based on stories told by Suetonius, which is an original ancient text. So I had an understanding of Rome from that perspective. And I had a boyfriend who was really into ancient history. His mother gave me a Christmas present of an American edition of Apicius. It was based on a translation from the 19th century, and it was not good in terms of its understanding of Latin, but it was the first time I encountered Apicius. And I looked at this book and I thought, wow, who, as a chef, suddenly being interested in Roman history, how serendipitous is this, that this book should exist? So I started experimenting and playing around with the recipes. I had no idea what kind of a journey it would take me on. And subsequently went to university and started a degree in ancient history and organised my first Roman banquet within about a year of being at college. I was 30 by this time. I didn't do my degree in my normal age group. And all my fellow students were all 19, 20, 21, and they didn't want to come to my banquet because the lecturers and professors did, because they wanted to taste Roman food and they never had. So I said, fine, you stay away, you have your toga parties, wrapped up in a sheet, drinking lots of beer, and call that a Roman party. I'll have a proper Roman party. And at this party, I met Andrew Dalby, and he is a very well-respected food historian of ancient Greek food and culture. He said to me after that banquet, Sally, you've got it. You have made Roman food taste good. And of course, that's how it all started.
What was it specifically about Rome that enchanted you enough to get you to go study it?
Ah, dear, it's so far away from where we are today. It's almost like science fiction. It's almost like an alien world because it is so different, and yet it's so close and it's so tangible. We can find so much of it out there in the archaeology, and yet it doesn't feel like the same world. So much about Roman society we really do not understand, because if somebody hasn't written about it, or the archaeology doesn't exist to illuminate an aspect of Roman life, then we just are completely in the blank. There's no information at all about so much about their lives. And that intrigued me.
Apicius, recipe number 316, another way to prepare truffles. Boil the truffles, sprinkle them with salt and fasten them on skewers. Half fry them and then place them in a saucepan with broth, virgin oil, reduced wine, a little bit of pure wine, crushed pepper, and a little honey. Allow them to finish. When done, bind the liquor with rue, prick the truffles so they may become saturated with the juice, dress them nicely, and when very hot, serve.
So Apicius, who and what is Apicius? Apicius is the name of a famous Roman gourmet, Marcus Gavius Apicius, who lived at the time of Tiberius. So we're talking between, say, 10 AD and 50 AD. And he was notorious for spending millions, the equivalent of millions of pounds on his menus, because he couldn't possibly eat ordinary food. Everything that he ate had to have provenance. It had to be the very best of everything. And he was living in the Bay of Naples region, probably had property in a place called Baiae in the Bay of Naples, which has some really quite impressive remains. And it was notorious as a resort for wealthy people. And there are some stories told about him. We don't know very much about him at all, but the famous story is that when he was told by his accountant that there was no more money left for all this really expensive food, you'd have to start eating ordinary food, i.e. food without provenance, nothing wrong with it, of course, just ordinary food, he decided to kill himself, poisoned himself with his last banquet. So whether it actually happened is hard to know. I think it's probably apocryphal, and but his name, it became synonymous with gourmet food. And it ultimately, Apicius just meant a collection of recipes that were good. We then find that there are recipe collections that survive. We hear about them being discussed in other literature. And so these kind of collections must have been widespread. But in fact, only one recipe collection survived into the Middle Ages in one monastery, because for some reason it was copied. And the only reason it survived is because as a text, it was used as a practice piece by scribes in the medieval period when they were training to illuminate Bibles. They couldn't make errors or mistakes with the Word of God, so they illuminated a recipe book instead. And it happened to be this collection of recipes. And so it survived.
As someone who's never had Roman food before, at least not old Roman food before, like what is kind of the palette of flavors that make Roman food Roman food?
Many of the dishes are basically sauces that you add to meat or vegetables. And at least half of the recipes will simply start pound in a mortar, pepper and lovage. Pepper is black pepper. It could be white too. And the lovage is a spice that's rarely used today. It's quite bitter, and you use quite a small amount of it. I managed to grow the plant now in my garden, so I have plenty. Pound, pepper and lovage. Then you would add, for instance, a sauce I recently made. Last week I made this Roman sauce. Add a teaspoon of cumin. Then fresh mint. And the whole lot is ground together into a paste. And then I added chopped up dried plums, a prune, and pine nuts. And the whole lot is pounded again. It's hard work. You keep on pounding all these ingredients into a paste. And then you add the liquids. And the liquids are oil, wine, vinegar, fish sauce, and honey. And it is remarkable in its flavour. Everything is in balance. And that was the dish. It said hot sauce for wild sheep, in fact, is the translation in Apicius. And that's a typical Roman sauce. Quite rich, quite sweet, quite dense.
Recipe number 210, boiled ostrich. In a stock kettle, boil mint, pepper, cumin, leeks, celery seed, dates, honey, vinegar, raisin wine, broth, and a little bit of oil. Thicken it with roux. Cut the ostrich meat in convenient pieces and add. Sprinkle with pepper.
It was always assumed that these recipes must have been written by somebody who was a gourmet, because a slave cook couldn't possibly read and write, surely. That was the assumption. Of course, that's false. Literacy was quite widespread, and particularly good and strong in the slave community, because they were engaged in business, they were engaged in trade, they were engaged in skills. The elite often had scribes to do their writing. and so this idea that reading and writing is an elite occupation was a false one. And slaves were collecting their recipes, sharing them amongst each other. There's a guild of cooks in Rome associated with the emperor, but there were other guilds that were less prestigious. And they almost certainly shared their recipes amongst them. And they had a library. It's very difficult to understand the demographics of Rome. But basically, for Roman society, it runs on slavery. It runs on people not having the right to choose what and where they do what they do.
Who were the slaves?
Ultimately, they were people from outside the empire. As the empire expanded, Roman soldiers, as part of their booty, would take on the native population and enslave them and bring them back to Rome and sell them on. And eventually, Roman society is largely made up of people who are descended from slaves.
I was going to ask you, you talk about Roman life very vividly in the introduction of your book, Cooking Apicius. Can you describe what it was like for the average Roman living around 2,000 years ago?
For somebody of reasonably safe economic status, they rise with the light because you don't waste your candles and your lamps. And you break your fast with a bit of stale bread from the day before. And you work through the cool of the morning. Your lunch is also a very scratch affair, something wrapped in bread. And as the sun gets to its hottest, you stop work. As a man, you would go to the baths in the mid-afternoon, and it's that point that you change your clothes, you clean yourself, and you put new tunics on, and you go home to dine at home, or you go and dine at somebody else's house. And you have a special pair of dining slippers that you carry with you. And you arrive for dinner, your outdoor shoes are removed, and you put on your dinner slippers, and you're welcomed into the dining room, and you recline. You lie on a couch, probably as a freedman would be on the second set of couches or at the bottom of the first set of couches, and a succession of meses are brought to you, or tapas. And you eat with your fingers, you are entertained, or you entertain, you're asked to recite something. It goes on until the light goes, and you wander home to your one-room apartment and begin again.
Recipe 111, dressing for a harmless salad. 2 ounces of ginger, 1 ounce of green rue, 1 ounce of meaty dates, 12 scruples of ground pepper, 1 ounce of good honey, and 8 ounces of either Ethiopian or Syrian cumin. Make an infusion of this in vinegar. You may take a small spoonful of this after the meal. What's your favorite recipe in the book?
I never have any doubt about this one. Stuffed kidneys. You make a pesto of black pepper, pine kernels, fresh coriander, and fennel seed. So you wrap it in caul fat, and you fry them off, and then you roast them in the oven. And it's just exquisite. I mean, I love offal. The Romans are very fond of offal. All these ingredients are not really valued today, and I believe in America, offal is not a popular dish. I used to be an ancient food consultant for the Getty Villa in Los Angeles, and I did a couple of Roman banquets for them, and I couldn't get offal on the menu. They also wanted an elite banquet, and I said, well, if it's an elite banquet, it's full of offal. That's what they like. But it didn't work, which is sad.
I guess what I'm really curious about is this is one of the oldest cookbooks in the world, right?
There's a few earlier actually, but yes, yeah.
So, this is some of the oldest recipes we have, not the oldest, but some of the oldest recipes we have. With so many hundreds and thousands of years removed from that, what if you put in all this work and the thing you make is entirely inaccurate, right? Despite all of your best efforts, is it actually possible to taste what Romans tasted?
Lots of people in the past have suggested that somehow ingredients change so much over the centuries, and our palates change so much over the centuries, that you can never get to the reality of what it tasted like. But I say no. Sometimes there are questions about the identity of spices because the names change and you can misidentify and misname things. But the basic ingredients, they haven't changed that much. Olive oil is still olive oil. Wine is still wine. And we know exactly how fish sauce was made. We know its salt content. We know the kind of fish that was used. We know how long it took. We know the process. And we can be fairly certain what it was and how it tasted. And I think you can taste what they tasted completely. One of the things that you discover when you do play around with recipes like this is you have revelations about the way people's lives were and how they acted, how they reacted with their food. You suddenly get an understanding, a real understanding of what life was like. Whether or not it tasted right or not, the process of cooking it gives you insights into Roman life.
My name is Jeff Emptman, and I made this episode of Here Be Monsters. Now, the recipes you heard me reading throughout this episode came from a pretty early English translation of Apicius, and it's essentially a word-for-word translation of the original, or at least that's what it's trying to be, but even the author notes that the translation can leave something to be desired just because there's kind of a lacking of context in the recipes, and the actual instructions can be either vague or just not there at all. So it's a really interesting historical document, but it would be a really hard version of Apicius to use as an actual cookbook. And that's where Sally Grainger's book, the one we were talking about on this episode, comes in. That book is called Cooking Apicius, and it's written like a modern cookbook. It tells you how to source or make a lot of the ingredients that you need to make these ancient recipes. So a couple nights ago, I cooked 2 recipes out of the book. I made a sauce out of raisins and wine and cheese and a bunch of herbs, and it was good. But what really amazed me was this lentil and leek dish that had me really nervous at first because I was like cooking in this way that I really wasn't used to, and I was using ingredients that I wasn't used to using. And I kept tasting these lentils all throughout their cooking process and wondering like why they didn't taste good at all. And then in the last step was to add this whole bunch of herbs in there all at once and to put some fish sauce in there. And then at that point I tasted it again, and it had just utterly transformed into this very delicate and complicated dish that was completely unlike any other lentils I've ever eaten before. When I was first tasting it, I took it out to my porch and I sat out there and I was tasting these lentils, and I was imagining someone 2,000 years ago in their special slippers on their special dining couch, tasting something that was very similar to what I was tasting right now. It kind of transported me a little bit, and it felt very special. Sally Grainger is a historian and author of several cookbooks on ancient food, including The Story of Garum, The Classical Cookbook, and Cooking Apicius. You can see photos of the food I made over on the website, which is hbmpodcast.com. There, you'll also find links to Sally's books and cooking videos. Also, you can buy your very own Here Be Monsters stickers. Again, that's hbmpodcast.com. Support for this podcast comes occasionally from advertisers, but more often it comes from people who just like this show and want to see it keep going. If that sounds like you, you can send a couple dollars my way each month by visiting patreon.com/hbmpodcast. And thank you so much if you're a member of Patreon already. I really do appreciate it. Music on this episode by The Black Spot. Thanks for listening. More episodes soon.